Please help me welcome JB for his talk on systems thinking in the UX process. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks everyone for coming. I love that everyone's here. We're trying to build up a really strong UX community, not just for a bunch of designers, but really just to instill UX as a kind of fundamental process in anything and everything you do. One thing that I'm very passionate about in particular is systems thinking, because this is an overlooked process that many of us are actually very instinctive about, but it was very life-changing for me when I learned what it was and the history behind it. I'm not going to give you the full-on history because I've done lectures where I give the full-on history of systems thinking, and that just bores the hell out of everybody. So just a short background on systems thinking, how it affected me. When I was doing my degree in depth psychology and spiritual psychology, there was a class called systems thinking. And I guess the point of me bringing this up is that when I learned what systems thinking was, the majority of the class did not know what systems thinking did and what it impacted. But if I were to sum it up, systems thinking is the recognition that from all points of order, it eventually falls into chaos and vice versa. And so for me to talk about this here, I want to showcase the fact that it is a fundamental part of UX. It just doesn't have all the labels of user experience. As before with any lectures I do, this is from my experience in UX design, business, and psychology. Everyone may have different findings and experiences as you take parts of this or from your own journey in life. For the content of this, I categorize this using tarot cards. Everyone starts off as the fool before they become the magician, and it's all about the journey on how you get to these points of recognition, understanding, and impact in your life. So let's start off with the fool. Everyone in UX oftentimes comes at this topic not knowing what's going on, where to find your kind of grounding, your foundation, your pillars. Everyone does have a UX process that is really what unifies us in total, but the tools that we use, the methods that we use, they're all different. And I want to kind of align where a lot of people are coming from with UX, and hopefully after this talk, you'll have some clarity, or at least an understanding how to find clarity. Now, let's go back to Donald Norman. He's one of our cherished fathers of UX. He still runs Nielsen and Norman. He speaks about how user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. And what's great is that you could still go to Nielsen Norman's website, and there's still great articles on how to research and find user experience metrics and methodologies. And he has this book that I'm sure everyone has touched on one point or another, The Design of Everyday Things. Everyone's familiar with this. Brady has showcased his process. Rod has shown his process at one point. And this is ultimately what the UX process is. We're going research, insight, the concept that you're building towards, and ultimately the design process. And as everyone knows, it is iterative. So this is not a one-line situation. You will have to repeat this in order to find things as you grow in your product or even in life. You can use the UX process in your life, and that's something that I hold to myself, and it's something that I exercise with systems thinking. Now, I don't know how much of the UX industry everyone is familiar with, but I always check UX Pin's metrics on where the industry is when it comes to their personnel and the experience of their personnel. And if you can see here, a majority of people are self-taught. Some of them have the four-year degree, usually in human computing interaction. And then we have those with master degrees and so on and so forth. So this is important because when everyone goes into UX and everyone's exploring UX, we're coming at this very raw. We're just taking piecemeal information from anything and everywhere. Whoever screams the loudest will probably pay attention to them with their methodologies and such. And so when we come into doing our jobs, when we're doing interaction design, service design, user interface design, you can imagine that a lot of times we'll face imposter syndrome and say, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, but at least I'm committing some form of work in order to reaffirm what I know. And with an iterative process, we're hoping that with each iteration, we know our work better, we know our process better. But here's the caveat to that. When you're in a leadership role, now it's your voice that commands the flow and the work and the perspective of your businesses, of your design, of your product, and of the people around you. And so even if we have things like CX, which is consumer experience, customer experience, they often share the same vein, their same origin in the UX process. And this can be very confusing because how do you know that what you're doing is correct? How do you know leadership is doing the correct type of UX? How do you know what correctness is? Well, that's the difficult part because we're only hoping that we have the methodologies that reinforce our work, or at least our approach, and reaffirming to us that we know what we're doing in the end. So leadership is a very important thing, but it's very troubling because a lot of people are, in the end, self-taught. There's no standard, there's no licensing, there's no like Six Sigma certification for this, which needs to happen for UX because we're running and gunning. The impact of our work is very pivotal, but at the same time, we don't have a lot of guarantees. So there's hundreds of articles on UX. I talked to Sam shortly about this before this talk, that how do you know what your tools are the right way to go about things? How do you know that your tools are going to give you the metrics that you're looking for? And I'm here to say that if you at least understand systems thinking, you'll know how to navigate these hundreds of articles, because even if you can collect all these articles, you could still end up with a clouded perspective on the best approach to your product and your situation. And I'm not saying the UX process has to be used in every given situation, but the UX process, ultimately, a number of us who do UX, we've had to use parts of the process, not all of it. But then again, as I mentioned before, how do you know that what you're doing is correct? So also I want to touch on the reason why a lot of those articles exist are for three reasons that I found. A lot of those articles that exist are for validation, personal validation. I put an article out because it validates my thought process. People give me feedback, I'll iterate on it, but ultimately it's to validate where I am in my profession, and it's also to market where I am in my profession. I'm creating an article because I want to show you that I know something. And if someone can click with it, well, then there we go. Recording, it's to record that I know something. It's an archive for your history of your career, where you were at when you did this, created this material. And as I mentioned before, these are often people the loudest ones in the room. And again, how do you validate that? How do you validate the loudest person in the room? In a field of saturation, it's very confusing, it's very troubling, and it doesn't help when anyone and everyone has imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is one of the biggest things that I ask every single professional, from CEO level of a multimillionaire company all the way down to a budding developer. It hits all of us, and it's very difficult to navigate that high saturation information on the net today. So let's go over, how do I figure things out? How do I create an internal process of navigation, affirmation, and validation? And for me, it's been through systems thinking. And this is how you can become the magician. First and foremost, let's talk about Gödel's incompleteness theorem. This is a mathematical theorem. I'm not going to bore you with the mathematics. But what I take away from this is you have to accept the fact that you won't know everything, and you can't know everything. In every single logic system, you can't say that I know everything about UX. I know everything about business. Because in the end, you can only know that system better if you sit outside of it. And that's the reason why this is important. Because let's say you're right here. You learned as much as you could in visual design. Well, it's not as good until you hit user interface. And that's not as good until you hit UX, and so on and so forth. So if you ever feel stuck, always know that usually maybe your peers most likely won't know everything, but you have to admit to yourself that there's room to grow. This helps in the collaborative sense, where if you have people that will admit, ego aside, that they're willing to learn more, to do more, then you're in good spirits, you have a good team going. If you ever feel like someone, or you experience someone saying that they have everything, they should be rest assured, oftentimes that's usually a protective shell. And it gets really complicated when you have these types of roadblocks in place, especially when you're trying to get the altruistic approach of user experience, when you're trying to satisfy and understand and be able to connect with your users. Peter Senge, I don't know how many people have read this book, The Fifth Discipline. It's an amazing book. He talks about how systems thinking is a discipline of seeing wholes. It is a framework for seeing interrelationships rather than things, for seeing patterns of change rather than static snapshots. What's amazing is that Peter Senge is from the MIT Sloan Institute of Management, and the origin of systems thinking comes from that college in MIT. And which is why it was amazing when I learned that he created this book, because if you want to know systems thinking and its application to all and various things, it would be from that school. So I'm going to share with you a video of how systems thinking is applied popularly to ecology, and you're going to see it with the impact of wolves.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. they began to meander less. There was less erosion, the channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Okay, so you can imagine sustainability has its hand with systems thinking. If you can imagine the impact of the wolves to the Yellowstone National Park, you can imagine how much UX can impact the entire business, from the business model all the way to the product that you create. I have to make a point though, systematic is not the same as systemic. This is actually a common problem. This is actually something I look out for when someone uses the term systemic versus systematic, because those are two very different implications. Systematic, of course, as you have here, is doing things in a very tight order. Systemic means that you're looking at the relationships, not the elements of things. And this was actually a problem because when I was reading through academic papers, these two get confused. So to go into a really big example, World War II yielded a lot of great approaches. This in particular is when they were trying to figure out how exactly are we going to save a lot of these planes in World War II, and the US Navy was instructed to analyze, well, how do we do this? And well, their results were very interesting. The Navy analysis is that they were looking at the wingtips, the central body, and the elevators. So basically anywhere there's a hole, they wanted to reinforce it. And that's what all the red dots are. Abraham Wald, the mathematical statistician, he was looking at, well, no, we have to actually reinforce the nose, the engine, and the mid-body. Reason being is that those were the only elements that were having those planes, be able to land safely and securely. Not the wingtips, central body, and elevators, but the ones that actually made it home had these things intact. So Abraham Wald was looking at things from a systemic point of view. He was looking at, well, for one, you'll only be able to analyze these planes once it made its way to base. And two, well, that actually saves everybody in the end because that's how it's going to run from one point to the other. So ultimately, what this points out is that when you use systemic approach, you will find answers that are very different from your first assumption, which is great with UX because we're talking to users, we're trying to figure out what is exactly do they want, and oftentimes that'll differ from what the business thinks. Now, if I were to boil down systems thinking to something very simple, it's really the UX process. This looks very much similar to a lot of people's understanding of the UX process. We have a goal, we have a decision, action, effects on environment, information. Similar but different. Another way to apply it is if we look at more complex systems, for instance, the traveling of energy and the exchange of money. We look at consumers, market, machines. Some of the most successful business people analyze these types of metrics, but not as cool as this cartoon. The Macroscope is also a book if you want to just learn more about it from a historical standpoint. It's a great book on systems thinking. Joël de Rosnay has a lot of great illustrations that help deliver his point. A lot more fun stuff. I had way more cartoons up here, but for the sake of time, I cut it down to these two. But in execution of systems thinking, this is what it looks like. A lot of stickies in a foreign language, don't worry about that. The point is not the elements, the point is the relationships. If you notice, there are pluses and minuses to these relationships, and sometimes even question marks. And the point of these arrows with the plus and minus is whether it's pointing out if it's a reinforcing flow or a detracting flow, a diminishing flow to a particular element. If some of you have committed to UX research methodologies, you know that you'll be able to find these types of relationships going on with your research, particularly user interviews or user tests. But having it in this format is very helpful because it helps you chart larger systems and impacts in play. I won't go into how those work because that's a more in-depth discussion on systems thinking. But as I mentioned before, it can drastically differ from the conclusion that you've had versus traditional forms of analysis. So ultimately, if I were to navigate the vast sea of information regarding UX, I would look at how does it affect the outcome. The key part about systems thinking is that you must have a goal. You must have a goal. If you're trying to get sales metrics up, you're looking at user satisfaction. And so by having that goal in mind, you're going to sweep through every piece of information that you're practicing in order to see if you can capture those metrics, see if you can capture that piece of success. And if you can do that, then you can imagine you can apply to most other things in life. Because the point that I really love to hold to myself is the fact that if I can intimate this, if I can intimate the process of having a goal and be open to executing and learning and doing all these things, well, then I've expressed a sense of mastery and confidence because I believe there was an astronaut, I forgot his name, where he said that, if you're ever afraid, knowing more helps create more confidence in yourself, and ultimately you become the magician over time. This is a great way to understand the difference between analytical thinking and systemic approach. Culturally, the Western culture will always go for a single discipline education. I remember some people going for a multidisciplinary approach, and this is the key part of systems thinking. The more you know in life, the more you experience in life, the better chance of you getting a longer term solution versus, let's say I'm highly specialized, my PhD is in one thing. You're most likely going to find a single term solution or short term solution in that. And that can be a very difficult situation. A good example that always is taught with systems thinking is, let's say you run an orchard and you want to deal with a particular pest that's assaulting your orchard. Well, the typical approach would be, I'm going to use a pesticide. Well, sure, it works temporarily, but you at the same time damage the entire ecosystem. Systemic solution would be you leverage the ecology of the entire situation. And so you use a competing creature that mitigates that pest and thus saving your orchard and I guess the ecosystem in the long term. So that's an example. Now, if any of you have seen the state of trends for UX in 2020, I know we've discussed this, I believe, in the last meetup. We're not looking at tools so much anymore. The new trends in UX are the people. Are you making an impact with your work? Are you making an impact with you being there in the entire structure of the company? Are you making an impact in just anything in general? And that's something that is very fascinating because for the longest of time when you're learning UX, we're learning about tools, we're learning about programs, we're learning about methodologies, but then how does that in the long term serve what we're trying to accomplish? Are we just going to be tools? Or are we going to be leaders in the situation? And when you lead, you oftentimes will control the entire narrative of reality going forward. Tanner Christensen, he's one of the moderators and admins of the Designers Guild, which I don't know if anyone's in it, but he works in Silicon Valley, and I've spoken to him before. Actually, the first conversation I had with him was about imposter syndrome, not feeling that you're good enough for something, and he constantly still has that no matter how much content he puts out with design and instructing people on design. But in this tweet, he points out that you shouldn't have to worry too much about the loudest voices in the field. In the end, there are other ways to do things. And in extension, I would say that you have to trust yourself a bit when you're doing the design, when you're following UX. I highly suggest that you truly understand yourself so that when you carry out the work, when you're carrying out the goal, when you're carrying out anything you do, that you do so confidently and you do so with the understanding that, well, if someone questions it, at least you've been thorough about your work, you've been consistent about your work, you've created clarity, not confusion in the long term. If you can speak positively on that, then it doesn't matter which way you do things, especially when you have the UX process and systems thinking under your belt. And with that, I'd like to conclude my talk. If you have any questions or comments, we have a little bit of time, but otherwise we can also talk about it right after.
Everybody, please give a hand to JB.